The metallic tang of diesel fumes mixed with cordite hung in the frozen air above the Vosges mountains as Second Lieutenant Audie Murphy pressed his back against the twisted hull of the tank destroyer. January 26, 1945, had dawned grey and bitter across eastern France, with snow falling in lazy spirals that seemed to mock the urgency crackling through his radio headset. The 3rd Infantry Division had been holding these positions for 3 days, their foxholes carved into earth so frozen it rang like concrete under entrenching tools. Murphy's M1 Garand felt heavier than usual in his gloved hands, not from its 8-pound weight, but from the certainty that today would demand everything he had left to give. The tank destroyer behind him, designated TD-324 on some distant motor pool roster, had taken a direct hit from German armor the previous evening. Its crew was gone, evacuated or worse, but the massive steel hull still provided the only substantial cover along this exposed stretch of road junction. Around him, the remnants of his platoon checked their ammunition with the practiced efficiency of men who had learned that survival depended on small rituals performed correctly. Private Martinez from San Antonio counted rifle clips with methodical precision. Sergeant Collins from Oklahoma cleaned the action of his carbine for the 3rd time in an hour, his breath forming small clouds in the sub-freezing air. Most were down to their last few magazines. The resupply convoy that should have arrived at dawn had been delayed by German artillery strikes on the supply road. The radio man beside Murphy, a kid named Henderson from Tennessee, whose hands shook more from cold than fear, adjusted his headset and grimaced. "Lieutenant, Captain Morrison's asking for our status. Says German reconnaissance spotted at least company strength moving through the tree line." Henderson's voice carried the particular strain of a soldier trying to sound professional while delivering news that could mean death for everyone within 50 yards. Murphy studied the forest edge through his rifle sight, calculating distances and angles with the mechanical precision that had kept him alive through Sicily, Italy, and the push into southern France. 400 yards of open ground stretched between their position and the dark line of pines where German forces were massing. Behind those trees, he could make out the angular silhouettes of armor beginning to probe forward, tanks that could reduce their improvised strongpoint to scrap metal and frozen earth within minutes. The smart, tactical choice was obvious. Fall back to the secondary defensive line, regroup with the main company, and live to fight another day. Any reasonable officer would order immediate withdrawal rather than risk 18 American lives against overwhelming German numerical superiority. Murphy's training at Officer Candidate School had hammered home the mathematics of small unit tactics. When facing odds of 4 or 5 to 1, preserve your force and seek more favorable terrain. But Murphy's mind calculated beyond immediate tactical considerations. If they withdrew now, the Germans would have clear access to the road junction behind them, the same intersection where an American convoy loaded with wounded soldiers and desperately needed ammunition was scheduled to pass within the hour. Those trucks, carrying casualties from yesterday's failed assault on the ridgeline to the south, would be sitting ducks on the open road if German forces controlled this position. The first enemy shots cracked overhead, rifle rounds that whispered past with the distinctive snap of bullets traveling faster than sound. Murphy made his decision with the quiet certainty that had carried him through 2 years of European combat, a choice that felt inevitable even as everything inside him recognized its near impossibility. "Henderson, tell Captain Morrison we're staying put," he said, his voice steadier than the hands that gripped his Garand. "We can hold them here until the convoy clears." The words sounded calmer than he felt, but they carried the authority of a man who had learned to make impossible choices seem routine. The tank destroyer that had seemed like a symbol of American mechanical failure suddenly transformed into their fortress, its damaged bulk offering angles of fire and protective cover that might, just might, be enough to accomplish what doctrine insisted was impossible. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation. And stay with us for the next chapters. The German probe began with the methodical precision Murphy had learned to expect from enemy forces in the Vosges Mountains. Machine gun positions opened fire from concealed locations along the tree line, their distinctive rapid chatter echoing across the frozen fields of eastern France. Mortar rounds began dropping with increasing accuracy, walking closer to the tank destroyer as German observers adjusted their fire. Murphy positioned himself at the rear of the damaged vehicle, using its height and bulk to survey the approaching threat. His M1 Garand rested against the twisted metal of what had once been the destroyer's main gun mount, the weapon feeling like an extension of his vision rather than just wood and steel. Through his iron sights, he could see grey figures beginning to emerge from the forest, German infantry moving with the confidence of men who knew they possessed overwhelming numerical superiority. "They're coming in waves," Sergeant Collins whispered, settling into position on Murphy's left flank. "First group looks like maybe 20 men, but there's more movement in those trees." Collins had been with the 3rd Infantry Division since North Africa, and his ability to read enemy deployments had kept the platoon alive through 3 major campaigns. Private Martinez crouched behind the tank destroyer's damaged track assembly, his Springfield aimed at the advancing infantry. "Lieutenant, what about that armor we spotted earlier? Those tanks are going to chew us up if they decide to move forward." His voice carried the particular tension of a soldier who understood exactly how vulnerable their position would become once German armor joined the assault. The radio man, Henderson, worked frantically with his equipment, trying to maintain contact with company headquarters, while incoming fire intensified around their position. "Sir, Captain Morrison wants to know if we need immediate artillery support. Says he can get us some fire missions if we can spot targets and hold long enough for adjustment." Murphy studied the tactical situation developing in front of them. The German infantry advance was textbook: fire and movement by squads, with covering positions established before each bound forward. Professional soldiers executing a plan designed to overwhelm a smaller force through coordinated pressure from multiple directions. What they hadn't expected was the determination of 18 Americans who refused to give ground when logic dictated immediate withdrawal. His first shot dropped a German sergeant who had moved too far forward while directing his squad's advance. The satisfying crack of the Garand echoed across the frozen field, and Murphy watched the enemy force hesitate as their leadership suddenly became more cautious. The second shot eliminated a machine gunner attempting to establish an enfilade position on their left flank. Around him, his men began returning fire with the disciplined volleys that marked veteran infantry. The tank destroyer, once a symbol of mechanical failure, became the anchor point for a defense that should have been impossible. Murphy moved from position to position along the vehicle's length, using every piece of cover it provided while directing his men's fire toward the most dangerous threats. The German advance began to slow, then stall completely as accurate American rifle fire made movement across the open ground increasingly costly. What should have been a quick overrun of an isolated position became a deliberate engagement that consumed time and resources the German commanders hadn't planned to spend. But Murphy knew this initial success was temporary. The enemy probe had been reconnaissance in force, designed to test American strength and identify defensive positions. The real assault would come soon, probably with armor support that would make their current tactics irrelevant. Every minute they held this position was borrowed time, purchased with ammunition they couldn't replace, and luck that couldn't last indefinitely. Henderson looked up from his radio with an expression that mixed relief and growing concern. "Lieutenant, convoy's been delayed another 30 minutes. Road conditions and enemy artillery up north. But Captain Morrison says if we can hold until then..." His voice trailed off as the implications became clear to everyone crouched behind the tank destroyer. The brief lull in German fire gave Murphy's men time to redistribute ammunition and assess their tactical situation. But the news crackling through Henderson's radio headset painted an increasingly grim picture across the Vosges Mountains front. Other 3rd Infantry Division positions were reporting heavy enemy activity, and the convoy carrying wounded soldiers from yesterday's ridge assault was still 40 minutes from their road junction in eastern France. "Sir, we're down to maybe 4 clips per man," Sergeant Collins reported quietly, his Oklahoma drawl carrying the particular gravity of a professional soldier delivering bad news. "Martinez found some loose rounds in the TD, but not enough to make much difference if they come at us again in strength." Murphy nodded, checking his own ammunition supply while scanning the tree line for signs of German movement. His M1 Garand held its 8-round clip with 2 spares remaining in his cartridge belt, 24 shots, to hold a position that military doctrine insisted required at least a full company to defend properly. The mathematics of small unit tactics were unforgiving, but Murphy had learned that mathematics could sometimes be overcome by men who refused to accept impossible odds. Private Martinez wiped condensation from his rifle sight and pointed toward the forest edge. "Movement in the pines, Lieutenant. Looks like they're bringing up more people, maybe some heavier weapons too." His young face carried the strain of combat that had aged every soldier in the 3rd Infantry Division far beyond their actual years. The radio crackled with fragmentary reports from adjacent units. German armor moving through the valleys south of their position, enemy artillery concentrating on American supply routes, and friendly forces spread too thin across the winter landscape of the Vosges. Henderson relayed each transmission with growing concern, understanding that help would not be coming from units already engaged in their own desperate actions. Murphy climbed onto the tank destroyer's deck, using its height to observe enemy preparations more clearly. Through the falling snow, he could see German soldiers establishing firing positions with the methodical precision that marked veteran troops. Machine guns were being emplaced to provide covering fire for the next assault, and the dark shapes of armor were becoming more visible through the trees. "They're taking their time now," Collins observed. "Figured out we're not going anywhere, so they're setting up to do this properly." His tone carried professional respect for enemy tactics, mixed with the fatalistic acceptance that came from 2 years of European combat experience. The weight of command settled more heavily on Murphy's shoulders as he considered their options. Every tactical manual emphasized the importance of preserving forces when facing overwhelming odds, but withdrawing now would expose the convoy to German fire when it reached the road junction. Those trucks carried wounded Americans whose survival depended on safe passage to rear-area medical facilities. Henderson looked up from his radio with news that crystallized their dilemma. "Lieutenant, convoy commander reports they're carrying 17 wounded, including 3 critical cases that won't survive another delay. Medical officer says they have to move now, or they'll lose those men anyway. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history." The decision formed in Murphy's mind with crystalline clarity, despite the impossibility of what he was choosing. The tank destroyer beneath his feet represented more than just damaged American equipment. It had become the physical manifestation of his refusal to abandon men who depended on him for survival. "We hold," he announced quietly, his words carrying across the frozen position with the finality of a man who understood exactly what he was asking from his soldiers. "Whatever it takes, we hold until that convoy clears the junction." The German assault began with a concentrated mortar barrage that shook the earth around the tank destroyer and filled the air with flying fragments of steel and frozen soil. The German mortar barrage lifted just as enemy infantry emerged from the tree line in a coordinated assault that demonstrated the professional competence Murphy had learned to expect from Wehrmacht forces in the Vosges Mountains. Multiple squads advanced by bounds across the frozen fields of eastern France, their movement covered by machine gun fire that forced the Americans to keep their heads down behind the tank destroyer's protective bulk. Murphy positioned himself at the vehicle's highest point, where the damaged gun mount provided both cover and elevation for observation. His M1 Garand became an extension of his will, each shot carefully placed to disrupt German fire teams before they could establish effective positions. The familiar weight and balance of the weapon felt reassuring in his hands, a tool he had learned to trust completely through months of 3rd Infantry Division combat experience. The first German to fall was a squad leader who had exposed himself while directing his men's advance. Murphy's shot dropped him cleanly at 300 yards, causing visible confusion among the troops who had been following his signals. The second target was a machine gunner attempting to establish enfilade fire from their left flank. Another clean hit that silenced a weapon capable of devastating their small defensive position. "They're trying to flank us on both sides," Sergeant Collins called out, his carbine firing measured shots at German infantry, attempting to work around the tank destroyer's protective coverage. "Martinez, watch that depression to our right. Perfect approach route if they get smart about it." Private Martinez shifted position to cover the potential avenue of attack, his rifle tracking movement through the sparse vegetation that dotted the frozen landscape. "I see them, Sergeant. 3, maybe 4 men working through that low ground." His voice carried the steady calm of a soldier who had learned to function effectively under pressure. Henderson crouched behind his radio, one hand holding the headset while the other gripped his carbine. "Lieutenant, convoy's 15 minutes out. Captain Morrison says artillery support is tied up with the action on Ridge 317, but he'll try to get us something if the situation becomes desperate." Murphy understood that the situation had already passed desperate and was approaching impossible. German forces were probing their position from 3 directions simultaneously, testing for weak points while maintaining sufficient pressure to prevent American maneuver. Classic small unit tactics executed with the competence that made Wehrmacht infantry formations so difficult to dislodge from defensive positions. But the tank destroyer provided advantages that German planners hadn't fully considered. Its bulk created multiple firing positions, each offering different angles of observation and cover. Murphy moved constantly along its length, appearing at unexpected points to engage targets before shifting to another position. The vehicle that had represented mechanical failure was becoming the foundation for a defense that defied tactical probability. The German assault reached its crescendo when enemy armor finally committed to the attack. 2 tanks emerged from the forest edge, their guns traversing to engage the American position, while infantry moved forward under their protective fire. The distinctive sound of tank engines mixed with the crack of rifles and chatter of automatic weapons, creating the symphony of mechanized warfare that had characterized fighting across the European theater. Murphy climbed higher onto the tank destroyer's deck, using every inch of elevation to maintain observation over the developing battlefield. His Garand continued its methodical work, picking off German soldiers who exposed themselves while supporting their armor advance. Each shot represented a small victory in an engagement that logic insisted they could not win. The moment of truth arrived when the lead German tank reached optimal firing position and began engaging their defensive position with high explosive rounds. The first shell struck the ground 20 yards short, showering the Americans with frozen earth and metal fragments. The second hit closer, close enough to ring the tank destroyer's hull like a massive bell. What the after-action reports would never capture, what the citation language could never convey, was the moment when Audie Murphy climbed fully onto the tank destroyer's burning deck and took control of its 50 caliber machine gun. The vehicle had caught fire when German tank rounds penetrated its engine compartment, and flames were beginning to spread toward the ammunition storage areas that could detonate at any second. Murphy's hands found the machine gun's grips, while smoke and heat rose around him. the massive weapon offering firepower that his M1 Garand could never match against the advancing German armor and infantry. From this exposed position atop the tank destroyer, he could see the entire battlefield spreading across the frozen landscape of the Vosges Mountains. Enemy soldiers advancing through the snow, tanks maneuvering for better firing positions, and the road junction behind him where American wounded would pass in less than 10 minutes. The secret that would haunt his dreams for decades afterward was simple. He was terrified. Not of dying. Combat in 3 campaigns with the 3rd Infantry Division had numbed him to that particular fear, but of failing the men who depended on his decisions in eastern France's bitter January cold. Every burst from the machine gun was fired by hands that trembled not from cold, but from the overwhelming weight of responsibility he carried. "Jesus Christ, Lieutenant, get down from there!" Sergeant Collins shouted over the sound of gunfire and exploding shells. "That thing's going to blow!" His voice carried the desperation of a veteran soldier watching his officer choose almost certain death to buy time for others. But Murphy continued firing, the .50 caliber rounds tearing into German infantry formations and forcing their supporting armor to maneuver away from effective firing positions. The machine gun gave him reach and power that individual rifle fire could never achieve, transforming their defensive position from a minor obstacle into a genuine threat that German commanders would have to address with serious resources. Henderson crouched behind his radio, relaying information between Murphy's exposed position and company headquarters. "Sir, convoy's 5 minutes out. Captain Morrison says hold for 5 more minutes and they'll be clear." His voice cracked with the strain of watching his lieutenant stand fully exposed on a burning vehicle, while enemy fire concentrated on their position. Private Martinez continued engaging German infantry from ground level, his rifle providing supporting fire, while Murphy drew most of the enemy's attention with the machine gun. "That man's lost his mind," he whispered to Collins, his words carrying equal measures of awe and terror. "Nobody stays up there that long and lives." The truth Murphy would never tell anyone, the memory that would wake him decades later in cold sweats, was the moment when he realized he might actually survive this impossible stand. German infantry had begun withdrawing, their officers recognizing that the position was too costly to assault directly. Enemy armor was repositioning rather than accepting casualties from the .50 caliber fire that could penetrate their lighter side armor. What felt like heroism from the outside was experienced as stubborn desperation from within, a refusal to let other Americans die because he had chosen the safe, reasonable course of action. The machine gun in his hands became a tool for imposing his will on a battlefield that should have been controlled by German numerical superiority and tactical advantage. The tank destroyer's ammunition finally detonated, just as the convoy's lead vehicle appeared on the road behind their position. Murphy jumped clear of the explosion, his uniform singed and his hearing damaged by the blast that marked the end of their defensive stand in the frozen fields of the Vosges Mountains. The convoy passed safely behind their position, while German forces withdrew to regroup, leaving the frozen battlefield around the destroyed tank destroyer littered with evidence of an engagement that had defied every tactical probability. Murphy sat in the snow beside what remained of the vehicle that had anchored their impossible defense, his ears still ringing from the ammunition explosion that had ended his stand on the burning deck. Sergeant Collins approached carefully, carrying a medical kit and wearing the expression of a man trying to process what he had witnessed. "Lieutenant, you need to let Doc check you out. That blast threw you a good 15 feet. His Oklahoma drawl carried a gentleness that hadn't been there before, the particular reverence reserved for men who had crossed lines that others could only imagine. Private Martinez stood quietly nearby, his rifle still in his hands, but his attention focused entirely on Murphy. "Sir, I counted maybe 50 Germans pulling back through those trees, 50 against our 18, and they decided we weren't worth the cost." His young voice held wonder at the mathematics of what they had accomplished in the frozen fields of eastern France. Henderson worked to re-establish radio contact with company headquarters, his hands shaking as he adjusted frequencies and checked connections. "Lieutenant, Captain Morrison's requesting immediate after-action report. Says Division wants details about the enemy force composition and casualty estimates." The routine military language felt inadequate to describe what had actually transpired at the road junction. Within hours, the engagement would be reduced to clean paragraphs in official reports. Second Lieutenant Murphy and 17 enlisted men successfully defended a key terrain feature against numerically superior enemy forces, preventing German access to vital supply routes in the 3rd Infantry Division sector. The citation language would mention extraordinary heroism and devotion to duty, but nothing about the terror that had driven every decision. Murphy accepted medical attention from the aide-man, who arrived with reinforcements, submitting to examinations and questions while his mind remained fixed on the moments atop the burning tank destroyer. The 50 caliber machine gun that had given him the firepower to hold the position was now twisted metal scattered across the Vosges Mountains landscape, but its weight and recoil remained embedded in his muscle memory. "They're talking about putting you in for something significant," Collins said quietly as medics finished their examination. Captain Morrison mentioned the Medal of Honor to someone on the radio net. The words hung in the frozen air, like a judgment that Murphy wasn't ready to accept. What they couldn't put in any report was the knowledge that he would carry this day for the rest of his life, not as a triumph, but as a reminder of how thin the line was between survival and annihilation in modern warfare. Every decision made in those crucial minutes would be second-guessed in quiet moments, for decades afterward, accompanied by the faces of men who hadn't been as lucky in other engagements across the European theatre. The convoy had carried its wounded safely to rear area medical facilities. 17 American soldiers, whose survival had depended on holding an impossible position for exactly the right amount of time. That mathematical precision would haunt Murphy's dreams more than the enemy fire or the burning tank destroyer. The knowledge that minutes mattered more than courage when calculating who lived and who didn't. Years later, when reporters asked about the action that made him America's most decorated soldier, Murphy would offer the standard responses about duty and protecting his men. But late at night, when diesel fumes or the sound of backfiring engines brought it all back, he would remember not the heroism, but the weight, the impossible heaviness of choosing to stand when every instinct screamed to run. If this story reminded you that behind every medal there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.